This week, we speak with John Butler from Guard Square. In the news segment, Pwn to Own rewards the hard work of finding simple vulns. Cloud security gains a guidance. An update for Azure Security benchmark appears. I try to speak through the rest of the show, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Modern software development and deployment paradigms require security testing solutions that are automated, accurate, and integrate into your DevOps workflow. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools, including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker, to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsys to learn more. Nearly every business today relies on mobile applications, yet the vast majority do not adequately secure them. Once downloaded, mobile apps escape your control outside the secure network perimeter, thus making them easy targets for hackers. Enter GuardSquare. From the makers of ProGuard, GuardSquare integrates transparently and seamlessly into the development process, adding multiple layers of protection to Android and iOS applications, and effectively hardening apps against both on-device and off-device attacks. Request a demo today of GuardSquare at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 93, recorded January 27th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Mike. Just say 2020. It's so much easier.
So much easier. I can't say anything today. It's not a good start for me. But we also do have John Kinsella. Hey, John.
Hey, how are you? This 2020 thing is still going to take me another month or two.
Lots of 2020s, absolutely. In fact, you can join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30 through April 1st at the Disney Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World Main Conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2020 and click the register button to register with our discount code. Our next webcast is February 13th with Sri Sundaralingam, Vice President, Product and Solutions Marketing at ExtraHop, where we will discuss cloud-native network detection and response. Register for our upcoming webcasts by visiting securityweekly.com, selecting the webcast drop-down from the top menu bar, and clicking Registration. John Butler is a pre-sales engineer at GuardSquare. Before joining GuardSquare, John worked as a security consultant, providing network and web application penetration testing. He holds several certifications in offensive security and is an active OWASP member. Hi, John. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you here because this is actually our first in-depth discussion on mobile security for this year. And, in 2019, looking at the OWASP API Security Top 10, there's not really much of a difference whether the client is a browser or a mobile device. But there's also an OWASP Mobile Security Top 10 that does highlight some security concerns that are pretty specific to mobile apps. So diving in, what are some of those differences, and which of the ones do you particularly like to focus on?
Sure. This is a great question. So, when we're looking at addressing OWASP, GuardSquare took a look at the OWASP Mobile Top 10, and finding 8 and 9 are code tampering and reverse engineering. This is really what we zoom in on and focus on mitigating. In our experience, developers have all the internal skills necessary to address findings 1 through 7, as well as 10, but they don't possess the skills and experience needed to implement the resilience layer as defined by OWASP. And this deals with fortifying mobile apps against specifically findings M8 and M9, code tampering and reverse engineering. So that's what we promote here at GuardSquare, and that's what we really zoom in on.
So number 8 in particular, code tampering. I have a couple mobile games myself, and I want to guess at the very least some of the reasons that developers will turn to code tampering or countermeasures will be to prevent cheating, prevent spoofing. things like that? Or is that about right? Are there other things I should be thinking of, or we as developers should be thinking of as reasons why we want to minimize the ability for attackers or for others to reverse engineer mobile apps?
Yeah, sure. So that is one great use case. There's a number of really popular attack vectors that start with code tampering, but anytime somebody's trying to decompile your app, modify it, and repackage it, anything that they're trying to do could be malicious, and this is what we're trying to prevent.
So, and now I know there's also the OWASP, in addition to the top 10, they have a mobile security testing guide. They have a lot of good resources. And one of even in the mobile security testing guide, there is the not a throwaway phrase, but a quite simple phrase that says, ultimately, the reverse engineer always wins. And now I think that can still be true while still putting in a lot of the effort to make the reverse engineer's life more difficult. It's like if we were to talk about DevSecOps more generally, or protecting environments, raising the attacker's cost. So if I have a mobile game and I want to minimize code tampering, prevent cheating as much as possible, what are some of the ways that I might go about doing this, or what can I expect either to obtain from dropping in third-party tooling, buying a solution, or trying to implement something myself?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the most frequent things that we see is that people are trying to implement do-it-yourself mechanisms, but there's so many different twists that attackers can put in order to bypass these basic detections. GuardSquare offers detection routines, 400 different detection routines for jailbreaking alone. So the diversification that we provide makes these almost impossible to circumvent. As you had mentioned, raising the cost is one of the most important things when trying to secure a mobile app. Our aim here at GuardSquare is to ensure that hackers will never see an ROI. Ultimately, hackers will be looking for a return on their investment. Their goal is to reverse engineer your app, and time is their investment, which they invest in good faith of getting somewhere. So by deploying our software, we ensure that the process of trying to reverse engineer and decompile an application would be so time consuming and difficult that it would prove economically infeasible for an attacker. And ultimately, hackers will move on to other applications to save time and to liquidate income quicker and easier.
So John, oh, sorry.
No, not at all. Continue.
I want you to finish. So are you actually embedding controls then directly into the mobile app itself? So when it's sitting on the phone or on the tablet or whatever, all those control mechanisms are actually embedded into the mobile application itself?
That's correct. So we have pieces of code that will provide detection for a number of different indicators of threat and compromise.
Got it. And so then that's just embedded through a set of libraries that the developers use to kind of just embed these static detection libraries into the code as it's going through the development process?
So DexGuard comes with an entire runtime library, and the runtime library offers a huge number of different checks in order to ensure that application environments are not and cannot be compromised through hooking, rooting, or jailbreaking. We also provide advanced obstruction for both debuggers and emulators, and the goal here is really just to take all the key enumeration tools away from attackers to force them into that static review, which we know will take such a tremendous amount of time and effort that it won't be worth that in the end. The way we do this is by spraying those checks throughout the code, and also by enabling our users to insert them throughout the code. If at any point indicators of those compromise have been detected, at that point, the app will crash randomly or return to a callback that's specified by the configuring team.
So putting my dev hat on, and even thinking of similar kind of approaches of indirection or perhaps even obfuscation inside of containers, or starting to hook syscalls, things like that. From an engineering perspective, one of the concerns that can come up initially is to say, well, is this going to interfere with my data flow or my control flow, or is it going to have a performance overhead that's in fact not going to be tenable, because we want to say, because one of the tenets we want to follow from a DevOps perspective is to say, yes, we want to introduce security as much as possible in as many places as possible, but we don't want to do this at the cost of the business or at the cost of too much, call it user friction within the product. So what does that look like from either from the implementation or from the performance perspective?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's one that we get a lot. Ultimately, we integrate with CI/CD pipelines very well, but we also, in terms of what we can offer from a security perspective and a performance perspective, people would be thinking, if you're going to provide all of these additional features to protect my mobile application, it's probably going to have some implications on my performance. This is actually one of our greatest selling points, and that's that we can actually optimize, shrink, and make your application run faster, all the while protecting it against all of these both dynamic and static attack vectors. So we can't provide specific benchmarks because it depends on the configuration as well as the separate features you use. One easy example would be is if you throw code virtualization, inside of an infinite loop, that will provide infinite amount of overhead. But as long as you're configuring these things right, the overhead should be very containable. Also, in terms of the performance overhead, from what we see, DexGuard inherits all of the configurations of ProGuard, which was our open source optimization tool that we had created before DexGuard. And in doing that, one of the valuable pieces to this is that we can actually show you all of the changes that we've made and the performance implications that have actually occurred through a statistics file that we provide. However, based on the benchmarks that we have, we can ensure that your program and application will see a reduction in size of between 5 to 70% and an increase in speed of 10 to 20%.
Cool. So then, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, is that performance gain because you're limiting certain functions or eliminating certain libraries that aren't used? I'm curious, how do you get some of that performance speed gain? There has to be some efficiencies there, right? So I'm just curious, what does DexGuard do that gives you that performance improvement?
It's a good question. So DexGuard provides a number of different optimizations to Java code, but also it performs a lot of dead code removal and things of this sort in order to reduce redundancy and to make your application run quicker and to run and also to shrink the file size in general.
But doesn't your average compiler do that type of thing?
Well, the compiler helps with this as well. However, we're actually there's a lot of processes that are going on throughout, and they're each helping, I would say, different things. So by shrinking, we're performing certain operations in order to shrink code, certain operations to enhance code, and certain operations to make the actual code run faster as well.
So one of the things that I think it's also important to make sure that we talk about the distinctions of what wouldn't this protect us from, because I think we're talking about cheating and preventing GPS spoofing, things like that, perhaps, or the attacks that might need to be more sophisticated than running the app within a virtualized environment and trying to cheat that way. But for example, as I'm gathering my thoughts here, looking at the other OWASP mobile top 10, I think it's, if you're using insecure data storage, if you're not using TLS, if there's there are authorization or authentication problems in your app, the types of call it hardening or reverse engineering countermeasures that this is doing, it's not like it's going to fix bad code, right? This is more about preventing reverse engineering and not so much about trying to address the rest of that, the mobile top 10.
Indeed, yeah. So, GuardSquare promotes secure coding practices and advocates the importance of secure coding throughout the entire SDLC. We can't fix poor implementations. So if things are constructed vulnerably, they will behave that way at runtime. We can make that extremely difficult to discover during static review, but ultimately issues with things like authentication or authorization, improper data storage, things like that, those are things that need to be taken care of by the development team, and it's not something that we resolve. Ultimately, however, because we provide the dynamic protections to force attackers into static review, it's going to become a lot harder to find those things during static review and throughout the process of reverse engineering because of the layered obfuscation that we provide.
So, kind of flipping this conversation around, let's do a 180 and talk a little bit about what do you do when you're looking at mobile apps, or you want to make sure that these types of you want to do some reverse engineering. You have your own either open source tools, own custom tools, techniques that you use to make sure that this reverse engineering is in fact raising the attacker cost and not just unfortunately creating some obfuscation that is trivially bypassed. So what does your toolbox look like, or what are some of the things that one or two of the items you start to look at when you approach reverse engineering an application, a mobile app?
Yeah, so some of the things that we recommend ultimately just throughout our process and throughout our manual are tools like Hopper or Ghidra. These are tools that can be used to decompile an application, to dump control flow graphs and things like that, as well as to look at assembly languages and constructs in order to confirm that they've actually been, the difficulty has been increased. So by using open source tools like these, as well as many others that we provide in our manual sections, we enable our users to provide and conduct all of the evaluations necessary to determine throughout a success criteria that the project requirements have been met and that the resulting code base is in fact secured against reverse engineering and code tampering.
What might be some of the things that you're looking for? So I know that some apps may, for one reason or another, be relying on white box crypto, meaning they actually have to embed keys within the app itself. Do you see things like that very often, or are there other particular design patterns that that the mobile apps need to have more, higher levels of countermeasures against reverse engineering? Or what would you be looking for when you start to poke about in the bits and bytes of an app?
Yeah, so ultimately, I think that this really varies application to application. Something that, just throughout our research here at GuardSquare, we analyzed over 3,000 applications across 158 countries to determine that less than 50%, only 48% of them have the proper security mechanisms in place to mitigate risk associated with reverse engineering and code tampering. And so the vulnerabilities that you'll find will vary. But things that you would be looking for, anything that can provide you as an attacker context to build out and stage a more sophisticated attack. This could be something as simple as instances of reflection, strings, and unprotected API keys throughout the application itself that haven't been properly secured or obfuscated, such that as you're going through that code, you can also search for valuable method calls that could be hooked and modified at runtime.
Cool. And you mentioned still on this topic of the other side of the fence, reverse engineering the apps. You mentioned Ghidra and Hopper. I think there's also Frida out there as another of the tools.
Yep.
How did you learn? How did you learn if others wanted to follow through and build some build these skills around reverse engineering? Because I think there's a lot more apps that are easily downloadable, obtainable off of all the mobile stores out there. What would be some other things or other techniques that you might suggest they go about doing, or ways that they can learn?
Yeah, so I think that one of the best ways to learn is just by doing, trying to download applications, trying to see what's available, trying to specify classes and methods, and just trying to hook those functions. Ultimately, there's a lot of tutorials and a lot of documentation online that supports this type of thing. And there's so many different tools that are available that are worth assessing. So Fishhook, Frida, Magisk. There's so many different frameworks that are available for application penetration testing. And from a penetration tester's perspective, it's not recommended to just use one tool, but to use every single tool, or as many as you can, in order to distribute the data, in order to see, what works and what doesn't. One thing that's worth mentioning is that the software we provide is not looking for indicators of one software or another, but rather the behaviors that are associated with that form of technology in general.
Well, yeah, so it's more like the feature detection rather than just saying, is this particular string, does this Cydia string show up or not, is not exactly the only thing you're relying on.
Exactly.
Yeah, we know signatures by themselves don't work necessarily, right? We've been there before.
Proven for a long time, not the way to go. Well, I'm curious too. So looping back again to the development side of things, there's obviously Android, iOS have native code development, but there's also I've seen here and there different approaches for in development teams that weigh the pros and cons of trying to do unified development, whether it's something like a pure React Native, or using if Electron. I'm not sure that Electron has a mobile. I know that it's basically HTML and JavaScript for desktop apps. But what have you seen in terms of, are there areas here, I guess is my question I'm getting to, that the code in the IDEs or code compilers, like John was alluding to, that if we do some static, static linking for our app, we can reduce our attack surface, because you'd mentioned that a little bit before too. How much can just reducing attack surface and static compiling get us towards these types of protections? Or if they don't, what are the important things that they're leaving out that we need we need extra steps to make reverse engineering that much more difficult?
To be honest with you, I don't work that much with our compiler backend, so it's a tough question for me to answer.
No worries. Yeah.
What I can say in terms of our backend is, we use a custom implementation of LLVM. That's something that we've developed, at least for IXGuard side. So I can tell you what we're using, but I can't tell you how it's implemented.
No, that sounds cool, because I think from on my side, I've always been a fan of LLVM just for all the different sanitizers it provides. So from looking at code from the security perspective rather than the call it the hardening or countering reverse engineering. But I guess on that let's talk just a little bit about the raising the attacker cost, because I think that's one of the things I wanted to highlight here, is that I've said obfuscation a few times, and that might anytime you use that word, security ears might perk up and say, are we really obtaining security here or not? And I think in this case, if we talk about attacker costs, the other term of art in the modern day is also kill chain, things like that. So what are the types of threats that you would be focusing on here, or perhaps whether they are techniques or different types of app developers, what type of attackers might they be worried about, or attack techniques might they be worried about?
Yeah. So ultimately, when we're looking at attackers, any piece of information that they can enumerate about your application becomes a potential vulnerability that can be used for them to stage a more sophisticated attack against your infrastructure. So what we're looking at is two types of hackers. There's the freelance hacker, somebody who might be just trying to discover some flaws, responsibly disclose this type of vulnerability to your organization, look for some credit, maybe a t-shirt, some swag. This isn't the guy that we're actually concerned about. The guy that we're concerned about is the guy who's actually downloading your application, reverse engineering it, and looking for something that he can exfiltrate or commit espionage by selling off to somebody. This happens all the time. And so when we're concerned about the people who are actually looking to reverse engineer your application from a time perspective, it really is all about increasing the amount of time and difficulty that it takes to get there. So by obfuscating every single statement by replacing even the simplest of arithmetic expressions with extremely complex ones. It increases the amount of time that it'll take an attacker to get from point A to point B. It makes that infeasible for anybody who is seeking a return on investment when that investment is time.
Hey, John, question. I don't think we've covered this yet. We've had this type of technology in general around for, at least 20 years, probably way more. When I'm talking about just, obfuscation or that sort of general category. What improvements do you see, or do you guys think that you guys have specifically now compared to what we've had over the last, like I said, 20, 30 years that would make this technology, I'll say more foolproof? I think a lot of times people have tried to do this, and it might slow folks down a little bit, but in the end run, if someone wants to get there, especially I think around the customer type you're talking about, or the attacker profile, if they really want to get in, they're going to be able to throw the resources at it. So what sort of cool stuff have you guys come up with that makes that much more difficult?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the biggest things that we offer is diversification of tactics that we're actually deploying. If you look at the original product that we released, which was open source, ProGuard, this is really just designed to optimize and shrink application files, as well as apply very basic obfuscation to class names, fields, and methods. But DexGuard actually goes so much farther than that. It obfuscates arithmetic instructions, control flow, native code and library names, resources, SDK method calls. But on top of just the obfuscation, DexGuard can also offer advanced encryption in the form of classes, strings, assets, resource files, and native libraries to ensure that your valuable and integral code base can't be ripped off, decompiled, reverse engineered. So one of the most important things that we go after here and that we advocate is taking a layered approach. And really, the notion behind that we subscribe to, at least, is that if somebody succeeds at one point, they're going to fail at another juncture.
But so to dig on that, that's a good example you gave. Encryption. I've got a binary. It might be encrypted, but to decrypt it on my computer, whether it's mobile or a laptop, I have to have the key. So the key is probably in that binary. So again, what sort of special do you guys have that makes it more difficult than it used to be?
Yeah, so just in terms of like what we are doing with encryption and with, let's just say, API keys, for example. With class encryption, this will occur on a bytecode level. We'll encrypt the entire class. These will be stored as separate files. They're only decrypted at runtime. And there's no way to really interpret this during static analysis. Somebody wouldn't know that that's there. If we're looking at things like sensitive strings or API keys could also be stored as assets or serialized data. However, if we're looking at API keys, we can fully encrypt API keys such that they can't be retrieved from source code if decompiled. And we use different encryption algorithms for every single key. These algorithms are stored as part of a pool of secure algorithms that we randomly use, such that if you reprocess the build, it's going to have a different representation each and every single time. The key becomes divided into multiple parts. It's not just stored as one single key. And we use a huge amount of randomization, as had been previously mentioned. The value to this is that if somebody succeeds in finding one key to decrypt, one key, they're not going to succeed, and they'll most certainly fail in decrypting all of the others unless they can succeed in finding all the other 40 separated keys, for example.
So by distributing and randomizing keys in your encryption algorithms, what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of time an attacker needs to actually get access to all the data that they're looking for.
Indeed, precisely. Also, there's just no congruency to any of the processes that we're taking. So anytime somebody thinks, there might be a pattern here, they're wrong.
The anti-pattern.
The anti-pattern is the only pattern. Yeah.
No, that's great because I think a lot of what this does is I think it helps us have if we're talking with the mobile development team going through threat modeling exercises, so we can say what assumptions or what controls are you expecting to have in place or not in place for your app to perform, and some of those would be do your security guarantees or your security controls rely on a device not being rooted or jailbroken? So being able to detect, to some degree, the presence of rooting or jailbreaking sounds like a good win to me if you can react to it. Same way I mentioned, like running an emulator, being resilient to debugging techniques, just to counter that, and so I guess I'm curious, do you have some additional tools or I guess more in the sense of like discussion tools or ways that you go with threat modeling, either customers or developers when you talk about the mobile top 10 and start then to talk about how to impede dynamic analysis and tampering, impeding reverse engineering, these types of things?
Yeah. So, and let me just let me go through some of the actual threat modeling things that we might recommend for some different tools. So, just in extreme brief, if you're looking at arithmetic obfuscation, you're going to require a disassembler like Hopper or Radar. So, you could use a number of different tools like IDA tool. There's Binary Ninja. There's Hydra, as you had mentioned. These are the tools that I tend to be using during my sanity checks when I'm performing these. And then again, the frameworks that we're using to detect and make sure that our software is actually compliant with the claims that we're making are really diverse. So typically what we're looking at again is Frida, Magisk, Substrate, Fishhook. But in terms of the sanity check items, when somebody has an issue or something like that, they can raise an issue. We'll perform a research on that. But our software has been designed specifically to circumvent these problems in order to detect these, in order to obstruct these types of attachments. So again, one of the biggest key differentiators between us and a do-it-yourself mechanism, which a lot of people think will suffice and just simply doesn't, is the amount of detection routines that we have. So almost like a dictionary attack, if you're trying to guess passwords, if you just have one, the probability that you're going to guess the password correctly is not very high. But if you have a huge list like RockU, you're going to do a lot more damage there. So by having a huge number of detection routines, we're able to detect a huge, huge number of attempts to compromise both environment, application, or code integrity.
Cool. Well, I want to thank you, John, because even though we've talked about reducing the attack surface and shrinking file sizes, we haven't managed to shrink the segment that we can have here. And we've had a really good discussion about mobile obfuscation, counter reverse engineering, and the tools that you've been working on and provide. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for your time as well.
I want to thank Matt and John, and we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to return with News of the Week.